George Washington is remembered as the commander who won the American Revolution. But before Trenton, before Princeton, before Yorktown, he made one of the most costly military decisions of his career. In the autumn of 1776, the Continental Army had already suffered a series of defeats around New York. Washington understood that preserving his army, not holding territory, would determine whether the fight for independence survived. Yet one important position remained behind: Fort Washington. Rather than abandoning the fort, Washington allowed nearly 2,800 Continental soldiers to remain on Manhattan Island against an overwhelming British force. The result would become one of the greatest disasters of the Revolutionary War, and one that may never have needed to happen. Fort Washington had originally been constructed to control the Hudson River and prevent British warships from moving freely between New York Harbor and the interior. On paper, it appeared to occupy an ideal defensive position above the river. Reality proved very different. Even while construction was still underway, British warships successfully sailed past the fort's guns, demonstrating that it could not accomplish the very mission for which it had been built. Meanwhile, General William Howe steadily pushed Washington's army from New York City and across Manhattan. After defeats at Harlem Heights and White Plains, Washington wisely withdrew the bulk of the Continental Army to preserve it for future operations. Only Fort Washington remained. Washington initially considered evacuating the position, but his trusted subordinate, General Nathanael Greene, argued that keeping the fort occupied would delay British operations and potentially inflict heavy casualties similar to those suffered by the British at Bunker Hill. Washington accepted Greene's recommendation. Instead of reducing the garrison, he reinforced it. General Howe immediately recognized that Fort Washington could not remain in American hands. On November 16, 1776, after hours of artillery bombardment, approximately 8,000 British and Hessian troops attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The Americans fought with tremendous determination. Hessian troops struggled up steep, rocky slopes under accurate American musket fire. British assaults met fierce resistance. Individual acts of heroism appeared throughout the battlefield. Among the most famous occurred when artilleryman John Corbin was killed beside his cannon. His wife, Margaret Corbin, immediately stepped forward, took his place, and continued firing until she herself was severely wounded. Despite this courage, numbers eventually told the story. The American defensive line stretched for miles. There simply were not enough soldiers to defend every approach. One position after another slowly collapsed. By late morning, surviving defenders were forced back inside Fort Washington itself. Once the British surrounded Fort Washington with artillery, Colonel Robert Magoff faced an impossible choice: continue resisting and risk the destruction of his command, or surrender. After roughly 5 hours of fighting, nearly 2,800 Continental soldiers laid down their arms. The British had eliminated the final American position on Manhattan. Yet the greatest loss may not have been the fort itself. It was the decision to defend it in the first place. Fort Washington could no longer control the Hudson River. Washington had already withdrawn the main Continental Army to preserve it, leaving thousands of experienced soldiers isolated inside an increasingly indefensible position, exposed them to exactly the disaster Washington had spent weeks trying to avoid. It became one of the most painful lessons of his military career. History remembers George Washington because he ultimately won the American Revolution. But great commanders are not defined only by their victories. They're also shaped by the mistakes they survive. The loss of Fort Washington deeply affected Washington, forcing him to rethink how he would fight the rest of the war. Only weeks later, those lessons helped shape his daring victories at Trenton and Princeton, campaigns that revived the Patriot cause when it seemed closest to collapse. Sometimes history's greatest victories begin with its most difficult defeats. History matters because people matter. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's story, I'd really appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe to HMS History with Michael Stroud. Those simple actions really make a tremendous difference in helping YouTube recommend these often overlooked stories to more people who love history. If you'd like even more, be sure to visit michaelgstroud.com where you can subscribe to the HMS Monthly Dispatch, my free monthly newsletter featuring behind the scenes research, upcoming projects, and exclusive historical thoughts. Until next time, history matters because people matter.